responsible for this action for others to live.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the world's loudest, most award-winning talk show host, the snow ghost with the snow most, Bruce Russell!
Thank you. Thank you.
Bruce, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you, Mike?
I'm very happy to be back to help co-host the second season of the Snow Ghost Community Show. I think we're back and we're better than ever.
I think so too.
And I think we've got some great guests today to kick off the second season.
But we do.
Who are these guys?
Tom Lewis and Michael True.
Tom, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
And you guys are here on the show today because we're going to talk about how it's the 40th anniversary of in some circles, very famous, in other circles, not so famous event, but an interesting event called the Catonsville Nine that Tom was a part of 40 years ago, this May. And to introduce this, I just wanted to read from Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, where he talks about the Catonsville Nine and puts it in context, I think. He says, the anti-war movement early in its growth found a strange new constituency, priests and nuns of the Catholic Church. Some of them had been aroused by the civil rights movement, others by their experiences in Latin America, where they saw poverty and injustice under governments supported by the United States. In the fall of 1967, Father Philip Berrigan, a Josephite priest who was a veteran of World War II, joined by artist Tom Lewis, and friends David Eberhardt and James Mengel, went to the office of a draft board in Baltimore, Maryland, drenched the draft records with blood, and waited to be arrested. They were put on trial and sentenced to prison terms of 2 to 6 years. The following May, Philip Berrigan and Tom Lewis, out on bail in the Baltimore case, were joined in a second action by Philip Berrigan's brother Daniel, a Jesuit priest who had visited North Vietnam and seen the effects of U.S. bombing. Those three and 6 other people went into a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland, removed records, and set them afire outside in the presence of reporters and onlookers. They were convicted and sentenced to prison and became famous as the Catonsville Nine. So that was 40 years ago, Tom.
Well, it was May 17th, 1968.
Mm-hmm.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
40 years ago. And then in some ways, not so long ago. And I think we'll touch into some of that in some of the dialogue. I brought some artwork that I did in prison. Prison was a big part of this.
Well,
we were in prison for 3 years.
So I wanted to ask you, now you and the other three, what they called the Baltimore Four, had already damaged draft records with blood. Was it your own blood that you used in the Baltimore Four, or was it?
It was a mixture.
Okay.
It was we didn't have the best equipment, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to make a clear statement about the killing that was going on in the war at the present moment. And we did that. We did that in that main draft board, which actually was across the street from my art studio. We walked into it. We knew that we would be able to do that from prior looking at it, checking it, and poured blood on those files. And our defense is that those were not files. In fact, they were death certificates as people were being sent continually to Vietnam. And they were dying.
And so then and the story as I heard it was that, I guess after you were convicted, but while you were still waiting for the sentence to be handed down, Philip Berrigan came up to you and said, Tom, let's do it again. And that was the beginning of the Catonsville Nine action.
I think that's a good way to put it, poetically
more or less what
and
happened?
Realistically. As the fine teacher that Philip Berrigan was, he presented that why not return? But we chose this time, we chose a different substance, and that had to do with the napalm that was being used in Vietnam, and we would use our own fire as a fire of hope on those draft files in Catonsville. We went to Catonsville because it was a draft board that we could carry our big wire baskets into, fill them up with many. These are large wire baskets of files. And took them into the parking lot, surrounded them, the 9 of us, set them fire with our homemade napalm based on a formula from the Army Special Forces Handbook. And we stood there for hope, we stood there for life, and our fire was a fire that would, in some way, reconcile the death of those who were died, and in another way, beyond symbolism, stop future deaths.
It's probably hard to appreciate 40 years later just how remarkable and how important that event was, especially for some of us who had been involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam. And it's hard to appreciate also how horrendous that war was, because there were 100,000 people being called up, 200,000 people a month. And the president was able to do that just with a snap of the finger. He didn't have to get any approval. So what Tom and his compatriots were doing were really alerting the United States once again to what a horrendous event this was, a totally unjust war against a people of Southeast Asia, an aggressive war, not unlike the one in Iraq. And so their action, although there had been previous ones, there had been, since 1965, there had been people who'd burned draft cards publicly at Arlington Street Church in Boston, and also at Union Square in New York. Tom Cornell among them, who'd gone to prison for 6 months. But this event was, it's hard to describe it, because it involved, first of all, 9 people, which is quite a lot in a civil disobedience. It involved 2 Catholic priests who had never been, Catholic priests had never been arrested, I think, before in the U.S. For civil disobedience. And these people were very well known. Phil was quite well known by then. He'd written 2 books, and in those books he talked about his gradual education, since he had been in the service during the Second World War, had actually been in Dresden. And so it was the dawning on him of an ex-serviceman of the horrendous nature of this war. Daniel Berrigan, his brother, who is slightly older, was very famous by this time. He'd won the Lamont Poetry Prize for the best poetry collection of the year in the 1950s. I had heard him speak at Holy Cross a couple of times before that, and he was teaching at Cornell. He had a national reputation, and so when Dan and Phil and Tom, who was of course well known, Tom had been working a lot in civil rights in Baltimore, and then the others too, the other people were extremely interesting. Marjorie and Tom Melville are 2 that I knew. They had been missionaries in Guatemala, Maryknoll missionaries, who then left teaching in the schools and went to work with the poor in Guatemala, and were then thrown out of the country. Tom and Marjorie had to leave. Tom's brother was actually put in the back of a car, in the trunk of a car, and driven from Guatemala to the Mexican-American border.
And kicked out of there.
And kicked out. And so all of this had been, of course, written about. And the Catholic press, especially, by this time there was a National Catholic Reporter that was carrying this news quite throughout the country. So that all of these things contributed to the fact that this was a major event. And of course, the follow-up on it proved that even more when Dan and Phil's pictures were on the cover of Time magazine and so on.
And that day has been turned into a play, which is still running. Just recently,
the trial.
The trial of the Catonsville Nine, and that day has turned into poetry, artworks, and many uses of our media to continue to speak about it. It wasn't over in that sense, I would say, artistically. And this wonderful artwork of Corita Kent, I think, really captures the initial part of this witness.
And
It's setting fire.
This is Father Daniel and Philip
This is
Berrigan.
Philip and Daniel Berrigan, and
What is that quote down there?
this
at
is
the
a
bottom?
quote at the bottom of this artwork. The first one is by myself, and then the second one is by Bill Kunstler. I recall what Thoreau said in his famous essay on civil disobedience. Under a government which imprisons unjustly, the true place for a just person is also in prison. To me, therefore, prison is a very creative way to say yes to life and no to war. Tom Lewis, the Catonsville Nine. And this states very accurately some of what I was feeling. I knew I would go to prison, having returned and still being held for a upcoming sentence from the Baltimore Four. And how would I take my life to prison? And how would I survive prison were certainly questions that come up. Some of my survival, I'm surrounded right here in this little chair.
All the artwork.
Woodcuts, and
Well, Tom, let me take
some
you.
poetry of Daniel.
Let me take you through the chronology of it, and maybe we can touch upon some of the artwork and poetry in amongst that. So, what are your memories of that day when you guys napalmed the draft records? What was the? Do you remember waking up that morning, or is it all a blur to you now?
Well, our memory was to keep a focus on the protest, and our responsibility was to maintain our commitment to nonviolence, and that's one of the reasons the files went to the parking lot and not inside the building itself, to protect those who were vulnerable, and to make our statement as clearly as possible, and then simply to put the rest in our faith, and our faith in the Spirit, our faith in God, and to make that statement and stand by what we did and where it would take us.
Okay.
I think this piece by Coretta Kent is a wonderful rendering of the event itself and sort of the way that it imposed itself on the public consciousness. The two priests burning draft files. Coretta Kent was also well known at that time. She's a sister who taught at the university in Southern California. So her work was well known. And this is just a hint. As Tom said, it didn't end with that action. There's a whole library of books now devoted to a discussion of what took place on that day and in the subsequent draft file burnings, because there were something like 80 of them later on, including destruction of draft files in Providence, in Boston, and other places. So it had repercussions that went on and on. It was followed by the Milwaukee 14 shortly after that, 3 Catholic priests from the Boston area and other people, and that went on and on. And there's a wonderful book about that called Divine Disobedience by Francine Duplessis Gray, which tells about the implications and the follow-up from the Catonsville Nine incident.
So after you napalmed the draft records, you waited around, and the police came and arrested you all, right? And then you went on trial. And as you said, there's a very interesting play by Daniel Berrigan, sort of taking testimony from the trial, trying to get into what people were thinking when they were doing this. It seems like people had different motivations, the different members of the Catonsville Nine, for going into it. I think that some of that comes out to the book. And as you mentioned, William Kunstler, who then later went on to defend the Chicago 7, was your lawyer in the trial. Do you have any?
He was at the trial. He was one of the lawyers.
One of the lawyers.
There were actually about 5 lawyers that became involved, and Bill was certainly one of the lawyers. The trial trial went on for approximately a week.
Okay.
And in the Baltimore courts, there were large demonstrations. There were seminarians from the seminary that did wonderful marches through the city. There were people that the peace movement really hadn't seen that much before emerging into the streets as a result of the Catonsville Nine action, and then, as Mike said, at least 80, I've heard to 100 other draft board raids, as they were called by the federal police, or federal government, who had every intention of putting us in jail as long as they could, and they did. Here's an example of jail right here, a etching of mine from that experience.
Okay. So whenever you guys were on trial, were you there with the expectation that you might be found not guilty, or did you see this as primarily a public platform, or what was your attitude?
All of those would be answered yes to,
all of the above.
Whatever else would be brought into it that's where I met Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker.
Okay.
I knew Dorothy through some writing, and I visited the Catholic worker in New York as a young artist. A friend of mine at the Catholic worker in Baltimore tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Somebody's here to see you." And I turned around, because you sit right up in the front of the courtroom, chained together. And I turned around, and I saw this beautiful face in the sunlight coming into the courtroom, shining on this woman with white hair, and that was Dorothy Day, who was not only loving and approving. It was a wonderful experience, which would continue after those 3 years I served in prison.
I think another thing to say about the trial is that and the play, it was a prize-winning play. It won a major prize, an Obie Award in New York. It was translated into 30 languages and performed all over the world. So the implications of the action and then of the art that followed were enormous. It was a very principal organizing tool, you might say, of the anti-war movement. Wherever this play was performed that Tom is in, it brought the whole incident to the attention of more and more people. I happened to see it in Syracuse, New York, to huge crowds, and very enthusiastically received, with the big exhibit of prison art in the museum that Daniel then introduced at that time too.
And I think it was performed in Worcester in 2004. Probably most recently. And I remember even that performance, it was very challenging for the performers and many of the people in the audience, because it just made people think about, what kind of stand am I willing to make for the things that I believe in? Are there things in the world today that seem as wrong to me as the Vietnam War seemed to these people? And if so, what should my response be?
Well, I think you were talking about motivation, the different motivations of the people involved. And as I said, Tom and Marjorie Melville came here to speak in Worcester in that summer of 1968. And they spoke at the YWCA because the dean at Assumption College would not allow them to speak on campus. It was a huge crowd. It was very well covered by the religion editor, a huge picture of Tom and Marjorie in the paper the next day with a very sympathetic story about them. The religion editor, who I think was a little skeptical about the whole thing, was totally taken by them, because they are extraordinary people. I mean, all the people were extraordinary, but I got to know them a little better. And one of the things that I think was very powerful about their testimony was that they said, "We are here to declare two wars unjust. First of all, the declared war against the Vietnamese, but the second one we're protesting is the undeclared war of the United States against the poor in Guatemala." And they had seen that at first hand, and were willing to take the risks that Tom took in order to bring this to the attention.
After the trial, you were found guilty. To cut to the chase, and you were all it seems like you were all sentenced to at least a year or two in federal prison.
3 years for Philip and myself, and the others were given 2 years.
Okay.
And we were all then split up into different prisons. and I was sent directly to Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And it was actually in Lewisburg where I continued my commitment to myself as an artist. Being in prison, I was not going to let them imprison my artwork.
Okay.
There was a place for arts and crafts. It took a while to be able to be, you might say, prisonly approved, as it takes time in prison for things. You learn patience. And I brought this woodcut. This is one of the woodcut series I did. And this is an actual piece of wood. This is part of a barn. They put me on the prison farm, and I was milking cows for my early part of sentence.
Okay.
When I finished milking cows, I was able to look around with my artistic eye and involve my survival in prison with some wood cutting. And I qualified for the arts and crafts room. And this is a
So this is a sunflower that you.
this is a sunflower. Here's a woodcut print of that sunflower right here.
That's
Okay.
great.
And
Well, maybe and we'll get a better shot of that for the. Oh, that's beautiful.
and so and then this is, as you can see, this is a portrait. I did 12 different woodcuts there. This portrait is interesting because it's, as artwork is, I look at it differently as years go on. But this is my one of my self-portraits, and it's done on a brown paper. That's the paper I printed on. Those of you who know about printing, I did not have the good Japanese paper and the kind of paper I can print on now.
So this is almost like a
that's a wrapping
This looks
paper.
like a paper bag, like a grocery sack, kind of.
And then I brought one of a large work,
Hold that up.
which is a what I would call, this was the last one I did, the woodcut, which I would call a work of hope. It symbolizes a landscape of hope. It symbolizes and it shows a lot of cunning, a lot of suffering to get to this hope.
And that one's called Cross and Resurrection.
That's called cross and resurrection. And in the traditional sense of the cross, we carried the cross with us, and we did suffer. And we worked with prisoners also. Philip writes beautifully about Dan working with prisoners in some of the literature, some of the books that were done.
People might be interested too in the impact that the Catonsville Nine had on Worcester itself.
Okay.
The very next day, it happened that Ammon Hennessy, the great Catholic worker and anarchist, was in town. He came to visit us several times and would speak at the Phoenix, and also was on Joe Hyder's radio program. He happened to be there on the 17th, so we immediately planned a sympathetic demonstration the next day on behalf of the Catonsville Nine here in Worcester. And then later, the floating parish of Worcester, which was an ecumenical liturgical experiment. We met in homes and in parks and so on. Dan met with us once in 1969 at a huge crowd in Upton. But then one Sunday, all of us from Worcester went to Danbury Prison to have our liturgy in support of Dan and Phil, who were in prison at that time. So, and then Holy Cross later had a special issue of the Holy Cross Quarterly devoted to the Barragans, which was then published in a book called The Barragans. But that brought the attention. It's, again, difficult to understand that Holy Cross, in a way, has a sort of conservative, you might say, background. But here, the graduates who were probably, some of them, horrified about their alumnus, that is, Phil burning draft files. Then their special issue of the Holy Cross Quarterly won a national award, so they thought it was all wonderful. But this included contributions by local people, and And the Holy Cross Quarterly was a great success. It received a lot of publicity nationally. So it just went on and on and on from your action to all these other incidents.
And I would say this on and on in more than a symbolic way continues. This is a recent January 2007, 2008 Catholic worker newspaper, and it speaks about Louis Vitale, 75, a Franciscan priest, and Steve Kelly, Jesuit, 58, in prison right now, serving 5 months for going to the Military Intelligence Center of the U.S. and trying to deliver a letter about torture and why torture should stop. And they were sentenced without even a trial for 5 months for trying to deliver that letter at a military
Fort
base.
Huachuca in Arizona.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if you guys wanted to read that Daniel Berrigan poem, and then we could move on to talk about sort of the present day repercussions of the Catonsville Nine.
Yeah, this poem I think is great because it conveys a lot of the spirit of Daniel Berrigan, even in prison. And he wrote, these are poems that were written in prison, and this has gone through a couple of editions. But it conveys very much his spirit. He's in his cell and looks down, and in the courtyard, a skunk comes in. And he says, well, the skunk, he welcomes him. And he says he's appropriately dressed in black and white, like the other prisoners. Skunk. And then he enlists him in the nonviolent movement. The only fauna admitted to the widespread country zoo, every animal in his natural habitat, no visible bars, was an unloquacious, bumbling skunk. He crept in under the full moon like a moon thing, eyes dazed, moonstruck, limped along unhandily as though on 5 feet or 3, footsore, looking for what? We wished he would breathe deep as an ancestor, metamorphose 10 times his size, piss high as the Versailles fountain, his remarkable musk perfume. We didn't want additional prisoners, even dumb ones. If they must come atavistic, mystical, then let them be spectaculars, troubleshooters. O skunk, raise against law and order your grandiose, geysering, stinking no.
That's great. That's great. We're coming close to the end of the show. I guess just to quickly recap, I just wanted to say that people involved with the Catonsville Nine, especially the Berrigans, went on to have a whole lifetimes of doing civil disobedience and activism, starting the Plowshares movement, which continues to try to beat swords into plowshares even today. And Tom Lewis certainly, any given month, may be doing an overnight in jail, as well as continuing with his artistry. And
right.
So I think it's just been a very. It seems like it was a real, not only an amazing statement to napalm the draft records, but also a seed planted.
And a major contribution to the history of nonviolence in the United States, which has a rich history of nonviolence, though we're not taught it at school. But from the 17th century on, we've had this. And this really, the Catonsville Nine, introduced a whole new dimension and raised all kinds of questions about other nonviolent strategies for social change. So we owe them a tremendous debt.
Well, in your predicted way, I do go to trial in March 20th for a die-in that we did at the Pentagon, and that was the religious remembrance of the slaughter of the innocents, and that was December the 28th, and the biblical time and the biblical story where Herod killed all the children, and we were saying very much in that protest involving people from Jonah House, for example, Liz McAllister, the wife of Philip Berrigan, who is no longer with us, and the children are dying, and we're responsible, and we did a die-in, And for that, we're going to go to trial, and you see what they did to the Catholic priest for the letter. I'm not sure what they'll do with us, but we run that risk.
Well, to completely shift gears, we wanted to give you a couple of gifts from our sponsor, the
Wonderful.
HBML Junk Shop. And in
Which junk
Worcester,
shop?
I don't know, which of them do you want to give this to? A little liquor dispenser? Who gets that, do you think, Bruce?
Well, thank you.
Tom.
Bruce is giving it to me.
If you want to drink
I'll
liquor
pass it on to
urinated by a
Michael,
statue of a
too.
boy.
Help yourself.
And also,
Bonnie Boy,
Oh,
liquor dispenser.
this is quite a gift.
it's a little pterodactyl.
We put the two together like this and become friends.
Hey, Mike, I got one question for you.
Bruce, do you have any final statements to the people of Worcester or the worldwide fans?
I just got one thing to say, Mike, before you answer that question.
All right.
My last final words for the Worcester and the worldwide fans is that when I first come doing these shows, I had to believe that they were going to be successful, because if I didn't think we were successful, then how would anybody else believe it? I had to believe that it was going to be successful, and just the same as well as that knowing that I became a star, I had to believe that I was going to become a star before anybody else did, because that way, if I wasn't going to believe it, how would I expect someone else to believe it first?